Training.com, CWI prep course. Come visit us at our website at train-eng.com, pronounced training. This is our CWI prep course. This is as you go through some of these videos, these will be some snippets or samples out of our online training course. If you like what you see here in the sample section, come and visit us and take the course. Unlike a lot of other programs, we've got it set up so that you can do it a la carte. If you only need we've got different parts of the CWI course broken out. So if you don't need to sit through and take safe practices for welding inspectors, or you have some strengths that you know of and you want to streamline the process and only hit the sections where you don't really have a strong background or a great deal of proficiency, our program is set up so you can take some of these parts of the CWI online course a la carte. Pick and choose, put together what you want. Leave the rest, like a Chinese food buffet. CWI prep course, Hazardous, Fumes and Gases, Module 2, Part 8. Learning objectives. Controlling hazardous fume and gases during welding, fumes and gases, health effects of breathing welding fumes, exposure factors, what is in a welding fume, reducing exposure to welding fumes, and types of ventilation. Here's a list of some OSHA standards applicable to welding. I'm not going to read through this whole list, but they're all listed there. I pulled this off an OSHA sheet. So if you really want to delve into the nitty-gritty of welding fumes and the other occupational hazards involved with welding, here are the documents that cover those subject matter. Okay, I borrowed most of this information from OSHA fact sheet DSG FS 3647-03-2013, controlling hazardous fume and gases during welding. Pretty good sheet, a lot of information on it, and I thought, they know more than I do. They're the guys that are writing it. So here we go. We're going to delve into it. I'm just giving them credit for what I'm borrowing from them. Welding joins materials together by melting a metal work piece along with filler metal to form a strong joint. The welding process produces visible smoke that contains harmful metal fumes and gas byproducts. Health effects of breathing welding fumes. Acute exposure to welding fume and gases can result in eye, nose, and throat irritation, dizziness, and nausea. Workers in the area who experience these symptoms should leave the area immediately and seek fresh air and obtain medical attention. Prolonged exposure to welding fume may cause lung damage and various types of cancer, including lung, larynx, and urinary tract. Health effects of certain fumes may include metal fume fever, stomach ulcers, kidney damage, nervous system damage. Prolonged exposure to manganese fume can cause Parkinson's-like symptoms. Gases such as helium, argon, and carbon dioxide displace oxygen in the air and can lead to suffocation, particularly when welding in confined or enclosed spaces. Carbon monoxide gas can form, posing serious asphyxiation hazard. Fumes and gases are generally a greater concern in arc welding than oxy-fuel gas welding, cutting, or brazing. Arc welding can generate a larger volume of fume and gas due to the variety of materials that can be involved. Protection from excess exposure can generally be done with ventilation. When exposure will be exceeded, permissible limits with available ventilation satisfactory respiratory protection shall be used. Protection must be provided for welding, cutting, and other personnel in the area. Arc welding types in order of decreasing fume production. Not all arc welding is the same in regards to fume production. Flux core arc welding is a much dirtier process in regards to producing fumes and gases, just due to the nature of the process, which we'll touch base on later. Shielded metal arc welding is number 2. Gas metal arc welding is number 3. And then gas tungsten arc welding, TIG, is the cleaner of them. But there's no flux being burned. There's nothing being kicked off there. from the arc. So, of course, TIG or gas tungsten arc welding is going to be a much cleaner process. And if you've ever been in any welding shops, depending on what process they're using, it'll tell you what the air quality is going to be. So just keep this in mind. Exposure factors. Welding rod composition, position of the head, type of ventilation, the work area, background fume level, design of welding helmet, base metal and surface condition, and air movement. These are all variables that come into play when figuring out exposure factors and how much of these chemicals or metals an individual has been exposed to. So these are all things that we need to be cognizant of in regards to welding fumes and generation of welding fumes. And when you're inspecting welds, you need to be cognizant of these things because you're breathing the same air that the welders are. Just because you're an inspector doesn't mean you're immune to any of these things. Exposure factors. Welding rod composition, position of the head, type of ventilation, the work area, background fume level, design of welding helmet, base metal and surface condition, and air movement. These are all variables that come into play when figuring out exposure factors and how much of these chemicals or metals an individual has been exposed to. So these are all things that we need to be cognizant of in regards to welding fumes and generation of welding fumes. And when you're inspecting welds, you need to be cognizant of these things because you're breathing the same air that the welders are. Just because you're an inspector doesn't mean you're immune to any of these things. Reducing exposure to welding fumes. Welders should understand the hazards of the materials they are working with. OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard requires employers to provide information and training for workers on hazardous materials in the workplace. Welding surfaces should be cleaned of any coating that could potentially create toxic exposure such as solvent, residue, and paint. Workers should position themselves to avoid breathing welding fumes and gases. For example, workers should stay upwind when welding in open or outdoor environments. General ventilation. The natural or forced movement of fresh air can reduce fume and gas levels in work area. Welding outdoors or in open workspaces does not guarantee adequate ventilation. In work areas without ventilation and exhaust systems, the welder should use natural drafts along with proper positioning to keep fume and gases away from themselves and other workers. Local exhaust ventilation systems can be used to remove fume and gases from the welder's breathing zone. Keep fume hoods, fume extractor guns, and vacuum nozzles close to the plume source to remove the maximum amount of fumes and gases. Portable or flexible exhaust systems can be positioned so that the fumes and gases are drawn away from the welder. Keep exhaust ports away from other workers. Consider substituting a lower fume generating or less toxic welding type or consumable. Do not weld in confined spaces without ventilation. Refer to applicable OSHA regulations. Respiratory protection may be required if work practices and ventilation do not reduce exposures to safe levels. Here's a couple of pictures of ventilation. You can see the fume plume as the guy's welding, but he's got his ventilation, his smoke sucker right over it, and he's sucking all the welding smoke and welding fumes out of his work area. He doesn't have his head directly over the work piece or the weld, and he's not just inhaling this stuff like there's no tomorrow. So these are things to keep in mind. And following is a list of types of ventilation: natural, general area mechanical ventilation, overhead exhaust hoods, portable local exhaust devices, downdraft tables, cross-draft tables, extractors built into the welding equipment, and air ventilated helmets. None of these is a one-size-fits-all type of silver bullet or a cure for any welding fume generation issues, but some work better than others depending on the situation. But just realize that there's more than one way to provide ventilation to a welding workspace. In this one, we talked about controlling hazardous fumes and gases during welding. Welding is a nasty job in regards to some of the materials that are kicked off in the fumes and the welding plume, I guess you would call it. There's a lot of metals in there that really aren't good for a human being to be breathing, so we want to avoid that. We talked about fumes and gases, health effects of breathing welding fumes, all the bad things that can happen, in the short term and the long term. If you're chronically breathing welding fumes and have your head over the smoke coming off a weld puddle. Exposure factors, different exposure factors that can affect your health and what you're breathing. We talked about what it was in a welding fume, how to reduce exposure to welding fumes, and we talked about different types of ventilation to use when welding. We've got one section where it's questions, and more questions. We've got a whole number of CWI self-study question bank, $40. Come on in, take it, take a look, see. If you just need questions, if you sat through another course and you just want to keep hitting the material, check out our question bank, $40. Our CWI CWE online Part A video course, $149. It's self-study CWI exam. Everything's an online video course.